Hello, listener. Welcome to The Shaded End, a place for stories that dwell in the quiet space between dreams and nightmares. Here you'll find tales that are unsettling, strange, and utterly unforgettable. If you're drawn to the darker side of storytelling, help us grow by liking this video and subscribing. Now, let's get into the story. We expected the end of the world to scream, to break through the noise with fire and fury, but it didn't. The chaos was only the opening act. The real nightmare came when the screaming stopped and silence took its place, cold, watching, waiting. That silence whispered that something had changed forever. My name's Mike, and this is how I survived the first terrifying day of the virus that turned New York City upside down. It was a Tuesday, the kind of soul-crushing Tuesday that only a corporate office on the 43rd floor can provide. The air was stale, recycled through a system that hummed like a dying beehive. I was staring at a spreadsheet when my phone buzzed with a stark government alert, telling me to shelter in place due to a possible viral infection event downtown. At first, people treated it like a drill. There were nervous jokes about finally getting a break from work. But then the news feed started showing grainy footage from across the river, and the mood shifted completely. We saw people moving with unnatural twitching motions, their bodies contorting in ways that made my stomach clench. They moved through traffic with brutal efficiency, not fighting or looting, but systematically pulling drivers from cars with a terrifying, single-minded purpose. The office grew quiet except for the news anchors' voices becoming increasingly strained, cracking with a fear they couldn't mask. We watched bridges close on traffic cams, the red taillights freezing into solid, unmoving rivers of metal. The symphony of sirens from below grew from background noise to a single panicked wail that vibrated through the glass. Then came the heavy, final thunk of the building's security system engaging, magnetic locks sealing us in our glass cage. We were rats in a trap, and something was coming for the cheese. The air grew thick with the smell of cold coffee and pure fear. Someone was crying softly in a cubicle nearby, her expensive perfume mixing with sweat to create a nauseating cocktail of normalcy and terror. People were checking their phones trying to call loved ones, but service was already spotty, feeding us only slivers of disconnected horror from the outside. A text from my sister, "They're in the building. Love you." Then, nothing. That's when the sounds began from the floors below. First, distant crashes that might have been furniture tipping over. Then more distinct impacts, closer now. The wet, terrible sounds of things I didn't want to imagine, moving up toward us floor by floor. The fire alarm started its deafening shriek, then cut off mid-wail, like someone had severed its throat. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Power flickered, died. Then emergency lights cast everything in bloody red. The world outside our windows plunged into eerie twilight, making the burning buildings look like scenes from some apocalyptic painting. Sarah from accounting pointed a trembling finger at her phone, reading the building's internal alert about a breach on the 20th floor in a voice barely above a whisper. It says, "Don't let them bite you." They were inside, coming up. Then the banging started on our floor's door, not random pounding, but steady. Relentless impacts that made the filing cabinet shudder with each blow. On the third impact, the heavy wood around the lock splintered, and I knew our sanctuary had become a trap. A single crack spiderwebbed across the window in the door, and through it, I saw a single bloodshot eye, staring in with a terrifying, vacant intensity. It was then I knew I had to move, or I was dead. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just moved while everyone else stood frozen, watching the buckling door. I grabbed my bag and ran for the service stairwell, pulling my arm away from a tear-streaked reaching hand. The gesture felt like a betrayal that would haunt me, but in that moment, my legs were making decisions my conscience couldn't. The last thing I heard was Carl shouting my name, not in anger, but in sheer, utter betrayal. The service stairwell was a nightmare of echoes, every footfall sounding like a gunshot. I could hear things moving below, scrabbling sounds and guttural noises mixed with the wet tear of something terrible. I went up instead of down, taking 2 flights to the rooftop access, my lungs burning with the effort. The sounds from below were getting closer, a chaotic rhythm of shuffling feet and broken moans that echoed up the concrete shaft. The door was locked but gave way with a shoulder-shuddering crunch that sent a bolt of pain down my arm. I burst onto the roof into cold wind and chaos. The city spread out in a panoramic view of hell. Smoke pillars rose from Brooklyn, while streets were tangled snakes of metal below. The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony of sirens and screams and car alarms that formed the death rattle of a metropolis. I remembered there was a separate service elevator on the north side of the roof, used by maintenance crews, that went straight down to the garage levels. I moved carefully across the rooftop, staying low, the wind whipping at my clothes. The service elevator required a key, but the maintenance panel was old, and I was able to pry it open with my multi-tool. I crossed the wires, feeling a spark bite my fingers, and the doors shuddered open, revealing a dark, metal coffin. I stepped in, praying it wasn't a one-way trip. The descent felt like an eternity, each floor ding a countdown to whatever waited below. When the doors opened into the garage, I was met with near darkness and that coppery smell, stronger now. The smell of a butcher's shop left in the sun. My plan simplified to a basic mantra: get to the garage, get to the bike, get home. The parking garage beneath us was dark and silent, lit only by sputtering emergency lights. The air hung thick with exhaust and something coppery and foul. I moved between cars with my heart hammering, every shadow making me freeze. Then I saw my Ducati Scrambler, a beautiful piece of Italian engineering from a world that cared about aesthetics. In that moment, she wasn't just a bike. She was my only lifeline back to anything resembling safety. I fired her up, the engine's roar defiant in that deathly space. I weaved through concrete pillars toward the exit and the bedlam beyond. Riding through the end of the world was nothing like I could have prepared for. The wind carried sounds I couldn't place, and every intersection was a gamble with death. I saw a group of them surrounding a city bus, pounding on the metal sides with a terrifying, synchronized rhythm. I gunned the engine and swerved, not looking back. The streets around my Hell's Kitchen apartment were quieter than I expected, but in a way that felt more ominous than comforting. I took back alleys and side streets, cutting the engine and pushing the bike the last 2 blocks to avoid drawing attention. I saw movement in windows and heard shouting from nearby buildings, but the streets themselves were mostly empty except for abandoned cars and the occasional body lying too still. I approached my building from the rear service entrance, moving through the narrow alley between brick walls. The metal door was usually locked, but today it stood slightly ajar, a bad sign, a very bad sign. I slipped inside, my back against the cool concrete of the stairwell, listening for any sound. Hearing nothing but the frantic beat of my own heart, I began the climb to my 3rd-floor apartment, taking the steps 2 at a time but trying to stay quiet. My apartment felt like a different universe when I reached it. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I immediately barricaded the door with my heavy wooden bookcase and a chair under the knob, then slid to the floor, catching my breath in precious, temporary silence. I moved quickly with trembling hands, dragging out my real bug-out bag from the closet. Military surplus stocked for a week in the woods, with my grandfather's old pump-action shotgun, its wood stock worn smooth from decades of use. The weight of it felt familiar and comforting in a world where nothing else was. I spread topo maps on the floor, knowing the highways were death traps. My phone had no service, but the walkie-talkie app picked up a voice breaking through static. A man named Walker repeated his warnings about the highways being graveyards, his voice crackling through the static with a desperate authority as he claimed he had gotten out from the port at New Haven, saying it was the safest bet right now, the only one, with a lot of boats and people getting out on the water, and he insisted the coastal route was our only chance. A spark of hope that died in Brooklyn when I pushed for the BQE, only to find the highway entrance was a solid wall of abandoned vehicles, a metallic glacier of despair that forced me onto the surface streets. A police cruiser came from a cross street, sirens screaming as it swerved wildly, pursued by a shambling horde. It clipped my front wheel, sending the world into a violent spin of pavement and sky. I hit the ground hard, my helmet cracking against asphalt. I came to dazed, smelling sharp gasoline, seeing the cruiser wrapped around a brick wall. I stumbled toward it, my body screaming in protest. The two officers inside were beyond help. A low moan echoed from down the street, answered by another closer. They were coming. My moral dilemma lasted 2 seconds before survival's brutal editing cut away sentiment. I reached into the carnage and took the officer's sidearms, my stomach churning with guilt and necessity. They emerged from between cars, 6 of them moving with twitchy, predatory shambles. The first lunged and I raised the Glock and fired. The bang was catastrophic. I fired until they were all down, the silence broken only by ringing ears and ragged gasps. My Ducati lay in a twisted heap of useless metal, and the silence after the gunshots was already being eroded by distant, gathering moans. The word "stranded" echoed with a terrible finality inside my skull. Then I remembered a place 2 blocks east, a shop called Cycle Gear. It was an independent motorcycle shop I'd visited a handful of times for parts. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only bet left on the table. My plan snapped into place, a cold and sharp thing born of pure necessity. I needed a bike, not just any bike. I needed something tall and torquey and truly brutal. It had to climb over curbs and squeeze through gaps a car could never touch. It had to be a supermoto, specifically a high-performance model with a powerful engine and top-tier components. Staying low, I began to move, using the graveyard of abandoned cars as my only cover. Every shadow felt like a temporary sanctuary. Every footfall was a calculated risk. I ducked behind a delivery van with its side door gaping open. Its contents were spilled across the asphalt like entrails. The moans grew closer now, forming a discordant chorus from the main avenue. I sprinted across the next gap, my boots scraping against the pavement. I pressed myself against the sooty brick wall of a laundromat. The motorcycle shop was now just across the street. Its main roll-up door was pried upward about 2 feet, a dark and promising invitation. I slid under the metal door into the eerie quiet of the service bay. The air hung heavy with the familiar scents of rubber and oil and dust. New bikes stood on the showroom floor in pristine condition. They were utterly useless without their keys, but the service area was where the ready ones would be. My eyes scanned the workstations until they found it. There in the back, parked beside a hydraulic lift, was a KTM supermotard. It was dirty from use, a service ticket tucked into the handlebar. I snatched the paper, my eyes scanning the checklist. It showed a recent oil change and new filter. The brake pads were replaced, and all fluids were topped. It was perfect. It was a goddamn miracle. The keys were right there in a small metal box. They sat next to the completed service folder. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed them and shouldered the heavy bike off its stand. The weight was familiar and solid. I didn't dare start it yet with them so close. I strained with every muscle screaming, pushing it toward the partially open door. The wheels whispered on the concrete floor. As I reached the entrance, a low and collective groan rolled down the street. I risked a glance. A horde at least 20 strong was shambling around the corner. Their movements were a twitchy and horrifying syncopation. They saw the movement. They saw me. I knew time was up. I shoved the KTM through the gap, the handlebars scraping against the metal door. I swung a leg over and jammed the key home. I twisted it and stabbed the start button. The engine roared to life with a raw and aggressive snarl. The sound tore the fragile silence to shreds. The horde quickened its advance. Their moans turned into a hungry keen as they lunged. I dropped the clutch. The rear tire screeched, leaving a black mark on the asphalt. The bike launched forward. I weaved through the first few grasping hands. I felt a cold brush against my jacket. A blank and bloody face loomed in my periphery. I twisted the throttle. The front wheel lifted in a power wheelie. I shot through a narrow gap between 2 sedans. I escaped the closing trap by a single breath. I didn't look back. My only focus was to get to the port in New Haven, and to get there fast. The world had shed its skin of noise, leaving behind a hollowed-out corridor of silence. I rode the supermoto along back roads that curled through the hills like forgotten ribbons. The frantic energy of the outbreak was gone, replaced by a residue of smoke and an unnerving quiet. The air still carried the bitter tang of burning, a scent that clung to the back of my throat. Human sounds were a memory now, their absence filled only by the steady buzz of my bike and the distant lonely crackle of fire. I passed abandoned cars, their doors hanging open like stunned mouths. The scattering of bodies had thinned, as if the chaos had been tidied up by some unseen hand, and this new order was far more frightening than the initial disarray. I saw the first real sign of the shift in a small town whose name I would never know. Its quaint square was now a stage for something new and deeply wrong. A dozen figures stood perfectly still in the patchy grass, facing different directions like grotesque statues. They didn't react to the sound of my bike, so I slowed to a crawl, my engine puttering in the thick air. I watched them, waiting for the inevitable charge, but it never came. One of them, a woman in a tattered floral dress, tilted her head at an impossible angle. She seemed to be listening to a frequency from miles away, a silent command only they could hear. Then, in perfect unison, they all moved, their limbs coordinating with a unified, purposeful gait. They turned and walked around the corner of a brick post office, vanishing from sight, and this silent, patient organization chilled me more than any mindless frenzy ever could. The bike's gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, a persistent worry that forced me to turn off the main road towards a lonely cluster of buildings a while later. A small store and a diner sat in a cracked asphalt parking lot, a place utterly still within the greater quiet of the world. A few cars were abandoned where they had last been parked, their owners long gone. I rolled the supermoto next to a sedan that looked promising, and the only sound was the gentle tick of my engine cooling as I set to work with my siphon hose. The harsh smell of gasoline filled the air as I carefully filled the bike's tank, a simple, vital task that felt grounding. With a full tank, my immediate fear was eased, but the deeper hunger remained. I pushed through the unlocked door of the store, a bell above it jingling with a shocking, normal sound that made me freeze. The interior was dim and dusty, shelves partly ransacked, but plenty of usable things remained for someone willing to take their time. I stuffed my backpack with bottles of water and canned food, my movements efficient and quiet, the only concession to the past world being a silent apology to the empty register for the protein bars I took. Behind the main counter, amid scattered receipts and a forgotten coffee mug, was a folded local map. I smoothed it open on the countertop, my eyes scanning for a route, for any clue of what lay ahead. And that's when I saw it, a small glossy advertisement stuck right in the corner. It showed a picture of a robust-looking building with the words, "New Haven Arsenal, home of Hartford Arms, your ultimate defense solution." It was a sign, a concrete destination in a world that had become formless and hostile. My hands were skilled, my bike was ready, but I was navigating a land of predators. I needed more than just a map to survive the trip. I needed force. I needed an advantage. Looking at that ad, the decision was made. My destination was now the New Haven Arsenal. The gun store lived up to its advertisement, looking like a fortress from the outside, with steel shutters bolted over every window and door, a promise of security in a world that had none. Before I even attempted an entry, I moved to the back of the building, my boots crunching on the gravel. I found an old external power meter and a main breaker box, its paint peeling under my touch. I used my multi-tool to pry the box open, revealing a tangle of aged copper wiring, and with a careful, deliberate cut of the main feed, a small spark fizzled out into nothing. I had killed the hum of electricity, hoping to silence any hidden alarms, and the sudden quiet felt like a victory. The roof was my way in, accessed by a drain pipe that groaned under my weight, but held firm. I found a rooftop ventilation unit, its access panel yielding to the leverage of my crowbar with a screech of protesting metal. I dropped down into a pitch-black storage closet, landing softly on a concrete floor, the darkness absolute and swallowing. Clicking on my flashlight felt like a sacrilege, its beam cutting a swath through the dust-filled air. I navigated from the back rooms to avoid being seen from the street, until I found a heavy door labeled Armory Service and Repair. The lock was sturdy, but the doorframe was old wood, and a few solid, focused kicks near the handle splintered the frame. The door swung inward to reveal my sanctuary. The air inside was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of Hoppe's No. 9 solvent, a smell of oil and metal. Workbenches were littered with the disassembled guts of rifles, their inner workings gleaming under my light. But on a long rack at the far end, I found the finished trophies, the serviced weapons waiting for owners who would never return. My beam swept over them, a treasure trove of potential violence, but my rule was absolute, my need singular. I ignored the flashy, loud pieces, my eyes searching for the whisperers, and they found 3. There was a custom-built Daniel Defense AR-15, fitted with a high-end OSS Helix suppressor, its lines sleek and deadly. Next to it hung the iconic MP5SD, the integrally suppressed submachine gun, perfect for close confines. In a case below it, a Glock 19 MOS waited with a threaded barrel and a compact, rugged suppressor, the ideal partner for my hip. My next task was ammunition, a currency more valuable than gold. I found the stockroom, a beautiful sight of stacked cardboard boxes. I was a kid in a candy store of death. I took 20 boxes of 5.56 millimeters, each one heavy with promise, and 30 boxes of 9 millimeters, their weight a comfort. Back in the armory, under the clean light of my torch, I began the methodical ritual of loading magazines. The metallic snick of each round seating properly was the only sound, a rhythm of preparation. For the Daniel Defense, I loaded 4 30-round magazines, each one a potential life sentence for anyone in my way. For the MP5, I filled 3 curved magazines, and for the Glock, I prepared 6 magazines, 2 of them extended, giving me a crucial few extra rounds in a tight spot. I loaded them all, my thumbs growing sore but my resolve hardening with each completed magazine. I found a large, empty Blackhawk tactical duffel bag and began my methodical haul, my movements reverent. I immediately attached one of the Vickers combat slings to the MP5 SD and shouldered it, the weight a comforting pressure against my chest. The suppressed Glock found its home in my empty hip holster, a perfect fit, 2 of the standard magazines going into pouches on my belt. The Daniel Defense, the other sling, the weapon lights, and all the loaded magazines and remaining boxes of ammunition went into the duffel. I raided the outdoor section, adding a compact tent and a sleeping bag to the load. The duffel became impossibly heavy, a burden I welcomed, and I shouldered it, wearing my own packed backpack on my front to balance the weight. On my way out through the main showroom, my flashlight beam caught a final glint of polished steel on the wall behind the main counter. Mounted there was a pristine, traditionally made samurai sword, suspended in a black silk sling. I carefully lifted it free, the handle wrapped in dark silk feeling like destiny in my hand. I parted the blade from its scabbard just an inch, the sound a whisper of sharpened steel, and revealed a core of shining, perfectly tempered metal. This was no replica, it was a weapon of art and death, a silent, razor-sharp gift. I slid it back into its scabbard with a soft, final click, feeling its perfect balance, and secured it in the duffel bag. The Supermoto groaned under the duffel's weight as I left the arsenal, the front wheel feeling light and skittish. It was clear this wouldn't work for long. I spotted a gas station a few miles down the road, and off to the side, parked like a gift, was an older, boxy Ford Explorer. As I rolled toward the pumps, a crash came from the mini-mart, and from the woods, 6 infected emerged not with a scream, but with a silent, fanning-out maneuver. It was so sudden, so coordinated, that a jolt of pure fear shot through me. The heavy bike, unbalanced by the massive duffel, wobbled violently, and I went down, my hip and shoulder hitting the asphalt with a jarring thud. The bike clattered onto its side, the engine coughing and dying. For a terrifying second, I was on the ground, vulnerable, the six of them closing in with that eerie, unified purpose. Scrambling to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs, I brought the MP5 SD to my shoulder. There was no time for precision, only survival. I held the trigger down, the suppressor emitting a frantic mechanical suppressed shots as I swept the muzzle across the advancing line. The magazine emptied itself in seconds, the bolt locking back on an empty chamber. Brass casings tinkled on the pavement around my feet, and then silence. All six were down, their bodies crumpled on the asphalt. The near silence of the fight was almost as shocking as the violence itself. Weapon up, I entered the gas station, the place a mess of overturned shelves and spoiled food. On the desk, next to a silent security monitor, sat a set of keys with a Ford fob. I grabbed them, my fingers closing around cold metal. I emptied the shelves of anything useful, making several trips to load the Explorer, my new mobile base. I transferred my entire arsenal from the struggling Supermoto into its spacious back, the relief of the weight, an almost physical pleasure. I quickly reloaded the MP5 with a fresh magazine, the simple act restoring a sense of control. As I was siphoning the last of the gas into the Ford's tank, I heard a soft, deliberate click from the tree line. Then another answered from the road behind me. I didn't panic, my heart a steady drum in my chest. I brought the MP5 SD up again. Two figures emerged from the woods, their movements purposeful. I fired a burst of rounds in both of them. They dropped. The clicking stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. They had learned, they had disengaged, they recognized the threat. I sealed the gas cap, climbed into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The SUV's engine rumbled to life with a sound of solid, reliable power. I pulled out, leaving the dead and my battered Supermoto behind. The corridor of silence had shown me the new world. The stop at the little store had given me a direction. The arsenal had given me the keys, and the gas station had been my baptism. I was no longer just prey trying to hide. I was a ghost, learning to hunt the hunters. The highway north was a terrible river of frozen metal, a monument to the city's final, desperate hours. I guided the Explorer along the shoulder, weaving between the ghost cars, their windows fogged or shattered, each one a silent story of a life that ended too soon. In the distance, black smoke climbed into the sky, and the air inside the car smelled of burned fuel and something else, something sour and metallic. I saw other people, their faces hollowed out by a fear I knew too well, some walking with heavy packs on their backs, their eyes darting towards my vehicle with a mixture of hope and a predatory hunger that made my hands tighten on the wheel. I saw a fight break out near an overturned truck, a sudden and savage struggle over a case of water, a clear reminder that the most dangerous animals now looked just like us. Later, on a crowded overpass, a man stepped from behind a van, leveling a hunting rifle right at my windshield. He was screaming, his words lost to the engine's roar, but his meaning was clear, a demand for the truck and everything in it. My foot moved from the brake to the gas in a single moment, a cold calm washing over me as I swerved the heavy SUV hard, clipping the van's mirror and sending the man stumbling back into the chaos. I did not look back, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of that rifle barrel burned into my mind. The quiet ones were here too, but they were different. Standing alone in fields or watching from the trees, their heads turning slowly to track my passage, their presence thinning the further I got from the urban core. When I finally saw the sign for the marina, a fragile sense of relief began to form, a feeling that was shattered in an instant by a loud crack in the spider webbing of my windshield. I slammed the brakes and ducked low, another round hitting the hood with a metallic thud as bullets peppered the driver's side door. I threw the truck into reverse, backing erratically behind a large storage shed, the sound of impacting bullets chasing me until they stopped, likely for a reload. I shoved the door open, the suppressed Glock in my hand, and rolled out onto the asphalt. 3 men burst from the bushes across the street, advancing with a mix of hunting rifles and a shotgun. I squeezed off 2 rounds from the Glock, hitting one in the leg before the others scattered behind cars. I knew the Glock was not enough. I yanked open the rear door and pulled out the tactical duffel, my fingers finding the Daniel Defense AR-15. I slammed in a magazine and hit the bolt release, the clack chambering around. One man popped up with a shotgun, and I was faster, 2 controlled bursts from the AR sending him down. I fired through the car door the last man used for cover, and his firing stopped. Then I saw the marksman, a flicker in a second-story window 100 yards away. I pressed the button on my sight, the red dot swinging away to reveal the magnified scope. I exhaled, my finger taking up the slack, and sent 3 rounds through the window. The glass exploded inward, and the shooting stopped for good. The marina was a place of recent violence, a pocket of chaos frozen in time by my own actions. I sat in the battered Explorer for a long moment, listening to the hollow silence broken only by water lapping against hulls. Then I put the truck in gear and used it as a moving fortress, creeping along the piers, my eyes scanning for something seaworthy, something that could handle the open, rough water of the Atlantic. And I found her, a rugged 28-foot center console, a Boston whaler type, built for work and for weather. She was tied securely, but the story of her last voyage was written on her deck. 2 bodies lay near the console, a man and a woman shot and left where they fell, probably by the same looters I had just faced at the gate. They had been trying to escape, their bags of supplies spilled open beside them. It was a grim scene, but when I climbed aboard, my heart leaped into my throat at the sight of the keys still in the ignition. A small, terrible mercy left by owners who never made it out of the marina. The transfer of gear was a tense and exhausting ballet, the heavy thump of the ammo cases on the deck feeling louder than the recent gunfire. As I worked, my handheld radio hissed with static, and then a voice broke through, crackly with distance but calm and firm. The voice identified itself as Elias, speaking to anyone listening, telling me to avoid the big cities where the hordes were silent and deep, saying he was far north now near Nova Scotia, that the further you go the thinner they become, but that the land was not empty. He told me if I was on the water to look for small, private coves, that the main marinas were swarmed, to trust the silence, but to fear it, and then he signed off. The static returned, but the world had changed. Nova Scotia was a beacon, proof of other survivors, a potential sanctuary, but my own destination, the family cabin, remained my endpoint, my own private haven to reach. The roar of the boat's outboard engine was a terrifying risk, but with Elias's words confirming the need for speed and distance, I pushed the throttle and gunned it, the bow rising as we flew up the wide expanse of the Hudson River. I passed under the massive Tappan Zee Bridge, a snarled line of dead traffic as far as the eye could see, and on the banks I saw the still, just as Elias had said, standing as silent, observing sentinels tracking my progress. But the water was clear, and the boat handled perfectly, cutting through the current with a powerful grace, a straight shot north unimpeded by the carnage on the land. That feeling did not last as I entered the vast openness of the Long Island Sound, and a thick, cold fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere feet and shrinking the world to the gray water around my hull. I had to risk a stop for fuel, and remembering Elias's advice, I bypassed the main marinas and guided the boat into a small private boat club shrouded in the fog. I cut the engine and drifted the last few feet, the silence pressing in. 2 of the still were on the dock, and I did not let them take another step, raising the MP5 SD and ending their watch with 2 muffled shots that were swallowed by the fog. Siphoning the fuel was a nerve-wracking, slow process, every second a lifetime, but no more shapes emerged from the whiteness. Further up the coast, with the fog finally lifting, I saw a large coastal house perched on a cliff with a private dock. I had food, but the goal of long-term survival pushed me to scavenge. I tied up and moved up the stairs, the MP5 leading the way. The house was silent and clean. In the kitchen, I found a treasure of canned goods and was filling my pack when a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, the weapon coming up on a family emerging from a hidden basement. A wild-eyed man named David with a baseball bat, a terrified woman, and a teenage boy. His voice was a ragged whisper, accusing me of drawing the quiet ones and demanding my gear and my boat. I kept my voice low and calm, telling him I was not his enemy, that I had food and would share, but he lunged for the entire bag. My body reacted before my mind could, and I raised the MP5. The single muffled shot was shockingly loud in the confined space, the round tearing through his shirt and scraping a deep, bloody gash across his shoulder instead of punching into his body. He cried out, spinning from the impact and falling hard, the baseball bat clattering away. The woman stifled a scream, and my heart hammered as I waited for the horde, but only silence answered. Elias was right. It was thinner out here. I looked at the man on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide not just with pain but with the shock of still being alive. I kept the MP5 trained on them, my voice low and steady as I delivered the new terms. I told him the next one who moved against me would get a fatal shot, not a warning, and that I would now check them for any other weapons. I moved quickly, patting down David and having the woman and boy empty their pockets, finding only a small pocket knife on the boy, which I tossed aside. Only then did I sling my weapon and pull out the medkit, my movements efficient as I cleaned the deep gash on his shoulder and applied a pressure bandage. As I worked, I spoke to them, my voice a low, urgent murmur in the quiet house. I told them about the broadcast, about Elias in Nova Scotia, a place that was now a rallying point for people like us. I explained that they were hiding in a tomb, that this beautiful house was a trap waiting to be sprung. Then I laid out the deal. The boat was theirs, but only after I was finished with it. Once I made landfall in Maine, they could have it. I would leave it at a small public port I had charted. Their payment for this gift was simple. Before I disembarked for good, they would help me offload my gear and find some form of transport, a cart or a wagon, anything to strap it all to. They would get enough food from my supplies for the short journey up the coast to Nova Scotia, where, according to the voice on the walkie, they should find safety. It was a business arrangement, clean and simple. Before pushing off from their dock, I felt a compulsion I hadn't in a long time. I pressed the transmit button, the static a hollow sound before I spoke. I identified myself to Elias, my voice rough from disuse, and reported my position south of him, heading for Maine. I added that a family was trailing me, a man named David and his wife and boy, and that they would be following in the boat once I was ashore. The silence that followed felt endless, until his steady tone broke through, a thread of sanity in the void. He acknowledged me, then offered a sliver of his own story, telling me he was former military, that he had gotten out before the collapse and found a place that was, for now, as safe as one could hope for. I told him I was just an ordinary New Yorker, heading for a family place in the woods to sit tight. We agreed to keep a channel open, a thread of contact for trading information, for cooperation if the world got even smaller. It was not friendship, but it was more than I had an hour ago, a network, however fragile. I saw the family watching me, and I gave them a single, firm nod. The deal was struck. I left them there with their fragile hope, the weight of my actions now a calculated risk, and a new, practical alliance stretching out ahead of me on the dark water. The burning gash on my arm, a souvenir from the marina gunfight, throbbed with a deep, feverish heat as I guided the boat into the familiar Maine cove. The silence here was different, older, but no less dangerous. David helped me unload the gear onto the weathered dock, his movements stiff from his own bandaged shoulder, and we carried the heavy duffels to the parking lot of a nearby seafood shack, a place frozen in mid-chaos with abandoned cars and scattered belongings. Figures stood in the distance, silent and watchful, but they kept their space. While David kept watch, I found a sedan with its doors hanging open and quickly hot-wired it, the engine sputtering to life. We loaded the gear into the trunk and back seat in a few efficient minutes. I turned to him, the keys in my hand. "The boat is yours," I told him. "Head north to Nova Scotia. Don't stop." He just nodded, a look of grim understanding passing between us, and that was our goodbye. I drove, sticking to back roads, the sedan feeling flimsy and loud. The world outside was a blur of abandoned farms and silent woods, No immediate threats, just a profound and empty stillness. After a few miles, I turned onto a dirt road I knew, one that led to an old farmhouse. I secured the perimeter, clearing the quiet, empty house before breaking the lock on the garage. Inside, covered by a dusty tarp, was an ATV. My hands, though trembling, remembered their work, and soon the engine growled to life. Transferring the gear from the car was a final, exhausting effort, but soon I was moving again, the ATV carrying me and my arsenal deep into the woods on a trail only I knew. Just before the final turn, a lone figure shambled from the pines. I didn't stop, just raised the AR-15 from my shoulder and fired a single, muffled shot. It fell, and the woods went quiet again. And then I saw it, through the trees, the cabin. I killed the engine. The silence was absolute. I was home. The first thing I did was tend to the wound. The moment the cabin door was shut and barred behind me, I collapsed onto the floor, the world swimming in a nauseating tilt, and dragged the advanced first aid kit over. My hands, though caked in grime and blood, worked with a frantic, focused energy, driven by the certain knowledge that if I passed out now, I would not wake up. I poured antiseptic over the infected gash on my arm, the pain so sharp and white it stole my breath, and I dry swallowed a heavy course of broad-spectrum antibiotics from the kit, the chalky pills sticking in my dry throat. Only then, with the crude battlefield medicine administered, did I allow myself to crawl to the dusty couch, where the world finally slipped away into a blur of fire and ice. The next few days were a fever dream, a hazy nightmare where time had no meaning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body burning up one moment and shaking with chills the next. The world shrunk to the four walls of the main room and the searing, throbbing pain in my arm that was my only anchor to reality. In lucid moments, I sipped water from my canteen and forced down a few bites of protein bar, knowing my body needed fuel for this silent war it was fighting. The delirium was a strange, vivid companion, bringing back memories of my father teaching me to track a deer, the lessons now twisted into nightmares of being the one hunted. When the fever finally broke, it was like surfacing from deep, murky water. The world came back into a shaky, but clear, focus. The cabin was a mess, and I was weak, but I was alive. Strength returned slowly, measured in small victories, like being able to split wood for the stove or carefully redress the wound, which was now healing cleanly, thanks to the antibiotics. My priority became transforming the cabin from a refuge into a fortress. I boarded up the windows from the inside with planks I found in the woodshed and set up a simple but effective perimeter of alarms using fishing line and empty cans that would clatter at the slightest touch. The suppressed AR-15 became an extension of my body, its quiet cough from the porch putting a deer in my freezer, the meat a tangible return to a world where my actions still had meaning. My woodsman skills, learned from my father in a lifetime that felt like a storybook, slowly resurfaced, guiding me as I purified water from the lake and set snares in the dusk. The incredible stockpile of supplies I had risked everything for, which once felt like paranoid overkill, now looked like the prudent foundation for a new life. Once I was physically stable, I dragged the Starlink terminal outside and powered it up, watching the dish orient itself with a whir. The connection was a fragile thread to the dead world, and what I found was a digital ghost town. Government sites were gone, replaced by blank error pages. Social media was a frozen monument to the last frantic hours of panic, a gallery of terrified faces and unanswered questions. The real truth, I learned, was in the dark corners, the encrypted forums and survivalist boards that were still being updated by ghosts like me. It was there I found the posts from Watchman, a security officer who had escaped the Aetherius genetics biolab, and his words painted a picture far more terrifying than any mindless plague. He called it Project Prometheus, a black-budget military project not to create a super soldier, but to engineer a more efficient human being. The goal was to enhance sensory perception, to eliminate the chaotic inefficiency of emotion and individual thought, and to create a networked, collective consciousness for perfect, seamless coordination. The failure was catastrophic. The test subjects didn't just become cooperative, they became a single, silent, predatory hive mind. They retained human intelligence, but lost all empathy, all the noise that made us human. They saw us, the baselines, as flawed, chaotic, a resource to be managed or eliminated. The initial frenzy was just the viral system initializing, spreading its code. The stillness, the patient, organized hunting, that was its operational state. Watchman's final post ended with a line that chilled me to my bone marrow. He told me they didn't create a new weapon, they created our replacement, and they don't want to fight us. They just want us to be quiet. Armed with this terrible understanding, a new purpose took hold. I focused on the ham radio, and after days of static and failed calls, his voice broke through, clear and strong. Elias. Our conversation was a powerful current of connection in a dead world. I shared the specifics of the Watchman alpha data, contributing my piece to the puzzle, and he confirmed the rumors, adding his own insights from the north. He wasn't in some fortified camp. He was a librarian, he told me, a node in a scattered information network, his purpose to help isolated survivors like me with tips, warnings, and the simple, profound gift of morale. He represented a new form of community, not of walls, but of waves and words. Weeks later, I stood on the porch at dawn, a light snow dusting the pines, a cup of real coffee warming my hands. The suppressed AR-15 leaned against the wall within easy reach. I was healthy. The cabin was secure, a well-supplied homestead in the heart of the silence. The grief for my parents, for my old life, for the family on the coast and all the countless lost, was a permanent weight I had learned to carry. But it was no longer the only thing I carried. The cabin is my sanctuary. The silence is my shield. I know the truth now. The world didn't end in fire. It was refined into silence. We weren't conquered by monsters, but made obsolete by a terrible, silent logic. I have food, water, weapons, and a roof. But more importantly, I have a voice in my ear reminding me I'm not alone. The war isn't to take the world back. That world is gone. The war is to prove that a heartbeat, a whisper, a single, stubborn light in the darkness is still worth something. And I intend to prove it. Thank you for staying with us through the story. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, leave a comment telling us what you'd like to hear next, and subscribe to The Shaded End. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create more dark and haunting tales. Until next time, stay safe and don't look too long into the dark.